My golden child brother stole our family home. Now he's begging for help after losing everything. Growing up, it was always clear to everyone that my brother Jake was the golden child. While I, Sarah, the younger sibling by 2 years, always tried to do everything right, it never seemed to matter. Jake could do no wrong in my parents' eyes, even when he clearly was at fault. If he broke something, it was an accident. If I broke something, it was carelessness. If Jake got into trouble at school, it was the teacher's fault. When I got in trouble, it was because I wasn't disciplined enough. It was exhausting. Still, I never thought it would escalate to what it did. You see, Jake wasn't just favored in small ways. He was given everything. As we grew older, this dynamic became even more obvious. When he wanted to go to an expensive college, my parents happily paid his tuition in full, no questions asked. Meanwhile, when it came time for me to go to school, they told me I had to make it on my own and learn the value of hard work. So, I took out loans, got a part-time job, and somehow managed to graduate with a decent degree. The final straw, though, came when our parents decided to retire and downsize their home. Our childhood home, a beautiful 2-story house with a big yard and a cozy, lived-in feel, had always meant the world to me. It was where we spent holidays, birthdays, and countless family gatherings. I assumed that when the time came, they would sell the house and split the proceeds between Jake and me equally. That's how it works in most families, right? Wrong. One day, my mom called me over for a family discussion. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, nervously sipping coffee, while my parents and Jake exchanged smug glances. That's when they dropped the bombshell. They had decided to sign the house over to Jake. "Wait, what?" I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why would you do that?" "Well, Jake is starting a family soon," my dad explained, as though it were the most logical thing in the world. "He and his fiancée will need the space, and they plan to raise kids here. It just makes sense." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jake hadn't even been married yet, and here they were, giving him our family home while I was still struggling to pay off my student loans. It wasn't fair, and it felt like a punch to the gut. "And what about me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't I get any say in this? Don't I deserve a share of the house too?" My mom looked at me with pity in her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, you don't have kids yet. You're young, you'll figure it out. We just want to help Jake get a good start." I felt the rage bubbling up inside me, but I knew arguing with them was pointless. I'd been fighting this battle my whole life, and I was never going to win. Jake was their golden child, and I was just an afterthought. That was the day I made a decision. If they were going to give Jake everything without a second thought, I would just step back and let them. I wasn't going to fight for something that clearly wasn't mine in their eyes. It hurt, but I was done being the second-class child. Jake moved into the house with his fiancée a few months later, and my parents retired to a small condo by the beach. I visited less and less after that, partly because it was too painful to see Jake living in what I thought would be my inheritance too, and partly because I was busy trying to build my own life. I had a job I enjoyed, a cozy apartment, and a few close friends who felt more like family than my own ever had. For a while, it seemed like everything had settled down. Jake got married, and I begrudgingly attended the wedding. My parents beamed with pride, of course, acting like Jake had won the lottery of life. They seemed so happy that I couldn't even be mad anymore. I'd accepted my place in the family, and I thought that was the end of it. But then, everything started to unravel. It began when Jake's business, this startup tech company he'd been working on, started to fail. I didn't know much about the details, but from what I gathered, he had poured most of his money into the business, convinced it was going to be the next big thing. Except it wasn't. He kept sinking money into it, borrowing from friends, taking out loans, and eventually even asking our parents for help. They gave him everything they had, of course, because that's what they did, but it wasn't enough. Soon Jake was drowning in debt, and the house, our family house, was in danger of being taken away. At first I heard about Jake's financial problems from my parents. They were stressed, worried sick about how much money Jake was losing, and how they couldn't keep helping him. I wasn't surprised. Jake had never been good with money. Growing up, he always had expensive tastes, but no sense of responsibility. Our parents would bail him out every time, but now it seemed like even they couldn't fix the mess he had gotten himself into. "Maybe you could help him out," my mom suggested during one of our strained phone calls. "Help him?" I nearly choked on my coffee. "How exactly do you expect me to do that, Mom? I'm still paying off my own debts. I don't have a house to mortgage, remember?" There was an awkward silence. My mom knew better than to bring up the house, but she tried to push forward. "He's your brother, Sarah. He's going through a hard time. Family supports each other, right?" I sighed. Family. That word had never felt more hollow to me. I had supported Jake my whole life, emotionally, financially, every way you could imagine, yet he had always taken and taken, never giving anything in return. And now, they wanted me to dig into my already tight finances to help him out of another hole he had dug for himself? The irony wasn't lost on me. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I can't do anything for him." For a while, I stayed out of it. I figured Jake would have to face the consequences eventually. If the business failed, it failed. That was life. But predictably, things only got worse. One night, I got a frantic call from my mom. Jake had defaulted on his loans, and the house, the same house that had been given to him so generously, was now in foreclosure. My parents were devastated, but I couldn't help but feel a pang of dark satisfaction. This was what happened when you handed everything to someone on a silver platter without making them work for it. "He's going to lose everything, Sarah," my mom sobbed over the phone. "The house, the business, all of it." I wanted to say maybe he should have thought about that before he gambled away his life on a failing business, but I bit my tongue. I knew my mom was hurting, and as much as I resented the situation, I didn't want to kick her while she was down. Still, there was no denying that part of me felt vindicated. Jake had been handed the world, and now it was all slipping through his fingers. But what I didn't expect was the call that came next. It was Jake. I hadn't spoken to him in months, maybe even a year. Our conversations had always been surface level at best, mostly because I couldn't stand his smug attitude. But now, his voice on the other end of the line sounded desperate, defeated. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need your help." I almost laughed. My help? The words felt surreal. Jake had never asked me for help before, not like this. He was always too proud, too confident that he could do everything on his own. But now, here he was, the golden child, begging me for help. "What do you want from me, Jake?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I'm losing everything," he said, his voice breaking. "The house is gone. The business is gone. I have nothing left. I don't know what to do." For a moment I was silent, letting his words sink in. This was the same house that had been stolen from me, the same business that had drained our parents' savings. Jake had been given everything, and now he had nothing. It was almost poetic. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, my voice cold, "but I don't know how I can help you." "Please," he begged. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've taken everything for granted, but I need a place to stay. I just need to get back on my feet. I have nowhere else to go." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jake, the golden child who had always had everything handed to him, was now asking to crash at my place. The irony was almost too much to bear. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face to finally show him what it felt like to be the one left out in the cold. But another part of me, the part that still believed in family, in forgiveness, hesitated. "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up before he could say anything else. That night, I lay awake in bed, torn between the desire to help my brother and the need to protect myself. Jake had never been there for me, not once in our lives. He had taken everything without a second thought, and now he wanted more. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the image of him standing outside, lost and desperate, with nowhere to go. Was I really going to be the kind of person who turned their back on family, even after everything? I finally fell asleep, my mind still racing, unsure of what to do. The next morning, I made my decision. The next morning, I woke up with a decision that both surprised and unsettled me. I would help Jake, at least in some small way. Not because I owed him anything, and certainly not because I thought he deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry the weight of turning my back on family for the rest of my life. I knew how much it would haunt me if I let him fall without offering even a shred of help. But there would be conditions. I wasn't going to let him waltz into my life and take advantage of my generosity the way he had done with our parents. If he wanted my help, he was going to have to earn it. I called him later that morning. His voice was raw with exhaustion when he picked up, and I could tell he hadn't slept much since we last spoke. "Sarah?" he answered, as if he couldn't believe I had actually called him back. "I've thought about what you said," I began, trying to keep my tone firm. "And I'm willing to help you, but it's not going to be easy, Jake. I'm not going to hand you anything like Mom and Dad did. You can stay with me, but there are rules. You're going to contribute, you're going to look for a job, and you're going to pay me rent once you're back on your feet. No more freeloading." There was a pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, I wondered if he was going to push back, but instead, he let out a long, shaky breath. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes." I wasn't sure I believed him, but I had to give him a chance. After all, I had never really given him the benefit of the doubt before. Maybe, just maybe, this was his rock-bottom moment. Maybe this was the wake-up call he needed to finally take responsibility for his life. A week later, Jake moved in. He had nothing but a few bags of clothes and some personal items. Everything else had been lost to foreclosure. It was a strange sight, seeing my brother, the one who had always been so smug and confident, looking so small and defeated. For the first few days, he barely spoke, just shuffled around my apartment like a shadow of his former self. I didn't press him. I figured he needed time to come to terms with everything that had happened. Losing the house, the business, his pride, it was a lot to process. But I also made it clear that I wasn't going to coddle him. The days of him being the golden child were over. If he wanted to get back on his feet, he was going to have to work for it. And to his credit, Jake did try. He applied for jobs, went on interviews, and even started helping around the apartment without me having to ask. For the first time in his life, he was putting in real effort. It wasn't perfect. There were days when he'd slip back into old habits, acting like the entitled person I had grown up with. But for the most part, he seemed to be genuinely trying to turn things around. One evening, after he had been staying with me for a few months, we sat down for dinner. It was one of the rare times we actually talked, really talked, about everything that had happened. "I didn't realize how much I had until I lost it all," Jake admitted, staring down at his plate. "The house, the business, the money. I took it all for granted. I thought it would always be there. I thought I was invincible." I nodded, listening quietly. It was strange hearing him talk like this, so self-aware, so vulnerable. It wasn't the Jake I was used to. "I didn't just lose the house," he continued, his voice heavy. "I lost Mom and Dad's trust. I lost their respect. They gave me everything and I threw it away." "You did," I said bluntly, not sugarcoating the truth. "But that's the problem, Jake. They gave you everything. You never had to work for any of it. That's why it was so easy for you to lose." He didn't argue. He just nodded, a deep sadness settling over his face. "I know. I see that now." There was a long silence between us. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't angry with Jake anymore. He had made mistakes, big ones, but so had our parents. They had set him up to fail by giving him everything without teaching him the value of hard work or responsibility. And while it wasn't entirely their fault, it wasn't entirely Jake's either. "I don't hate you, you know," I said quietly, surprising even myself. "I resented you for a long time. But I don't hate you. I just hated the way things were." Jake looked at me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before. Gratitude. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Sarah. I know I don't." It's not about what you deserve, I said, leaning back in my chair. It's about what you do from here. You have a second chance now. Don't waste it. Jake stayed with me for another few months before he finally found a job that allowed him to move out. He didn't ask for any more handouts, didn't try to take advantage of my generosity. Instead, he quietly worked to rebuild his life piece by piece. It wasn't easy for him, but he kept at it. As for the house, it's long gone now, sold to some new family who will hopefully take better care of it than Jake ever did. But I don't think about the house much anymore. I've learned that sometimes letting go of the things you thought you wanted is the only way to find peace. Jake and I still talk, though we're not as close as most siblings. There's too much history between us for things to ever be fully normal. But we're better now, and that's enough for me. In the end, I guess I did forgive him, but on my terms. Not because he deserved it, but because I wanted to free myself from the resentment that had weighed me down for so long. And honestly, I think that's the real victory.